Welcome to the sixth in a series of online interviews with Richard Harvey. My name is Rob Meager. Today's interview will discuss the lecture Awakening the Heart Nature, the Flowering of Self-Nature and the Surrender of Compassion and Authenticity, Part 2 of 2. This lecture was given online originally on July 10th, 2013, and it is available in written form in Moksha Dawn, an ebook you can order at the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/books. You can also listen to the full recording of many of these lectures on the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/education. And now a little bit of background about Richard Harvey. He is a psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. His work emerged out of the human potential movement of the 1970s. He trained with many teachers in humanistic and transpersonal approaches. He is the founder of Sacred Attention Therapy, a radical new approach to inner work for the 21st century that proposes a three-stage model of human awakening. Richard is the author of Your Essential Self and The Flight of Consciousness, among many other publications. He works with people all around the world, and his forthcoming book is entitled Your Sacred Calling. And to begin today's interview, Richard, I want to talk about the spiritual concept or psychological concept of separation. And you begin the lecture, Awakening the Heart Nature, with a passage I want to read leading into my question for you. You share near the beginning of the lecture, quote, "We have the relational context in the family home, the stricter house filled with tension, the unloving house where food is given through love is withheld, and we have my early home environment, a hotel full of strangers. Everyone and everything is in context. The word context originally meant woven together. You do not stand alone, and neither does your friend, your family, your dog, or cat. We are all woven together. This should show you that we are not separate. This is proof that the ego lies when it identifies you as someone, separates you from everything else, and divides you physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually from existence." And I wanted to begin this interview with you, Richard, by asking, what and where is our sense of separation born from? Where does it originate from?
The suffering of the individual separate self, in its fulfillment, turns out to be a means, turns out to be the way. Each of us in an individual life has suffered, and we have our reactions to the events of our individual life that all turn out over time to be a blessing in the spiritual realm, a means, a way. Only through suffering do I penetrate the veil of delusion and come through. If I didn't suffer, I wouldn't be compelled to do something with my life. It's the suffering itself that is the spark, shall we say. And so this separation of self, however deluded, is the means offered, it is the blessing of the human life. because the human being is distinguished by the ability not only to be self-aware, but to take self-aware to a fulfillment in self-realization. But if you were happy or relatively deluded and relatively happy, as is the case with many people, you wouldn't be urged, you wouldn't feel the impulse to seek out a guide, to find some release from suffering, to become involved in meditation or spiritual therapy or any of these things. There would be nothing that pushed you into it, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
So it is the very spark, it's the embers that you blow on, it's the primary impulse toward realization, toward awakening, toward enlightenment. Not that these things are synonymous, but this whole trail of appearing in truth. Now, the explanation of where the selfhood appears, or the false selfhood, or the small self appears, of course, is many and many traditions and many ways and means to see that. But I particularly like the reflection of the Absolute, or the reflection of God, in the realm of space and time, is a temporary, separate adaptation. It's rather like a beautiful gem that has many different faces, many different sides on it, which is whole, which is one, and yet these many different faces, when the light of the sun comes through, shines in different ways, and each one, of course, is unique. If we can imagine a gigantic, almost infinite, wonderful gem shining with light coming through it, it's not only whole, but it's also divided through these separate rays that splinter through it, and each separate face then appears absolutely unique, although in origins it actually comes from the unified gem. So this is what we are, really. I mean, we're projections of rays of light coming through a great big gem or prism. Let's call the gem or prism God, and let's call all of the separate faces with their appearances different, apparently separate, but entities, which are in fact adaptations temporarily of the divine in space and time. And let's have that light standing, of course, for enlightenment itself, or Turiya, or the fourth state, or the divine source of enlightenment shot through everything that appears somehow to be separate.
So each thing that appears to be separate is merely a fractal, or it's an aspect of this large gem.
That's half the story, of course, but well put. But we remember perhaps Sri Ramana Maharshi saying, everyone knows the drop is in the ocean, but not many know the ocean is in the drop. And so what you're saying, of course, is true, but it's also half of the truth. And the more difficult thing to get, of course, and which we really do need to get, is that you are the totality. You are all of it. I mean, in that moment, if we use the gem analogy, if you take off if it were possible, any one face of this hard gem through which the light is coming, you now have a broken stone. You now have a gem that's incomplete with a hole. You've changed it from some, in the analogy, perfect gem, beautiful gem, whole gem, into something that's fractured and into something that is to some degree annihilated. You can't do that in this analogy. It stands for God. God is all. This is the divine source. So therefore, we have to try and grasp the spiritual truth that I am the totality. I'm not just a part of it. You are the totality, and your complete expression of it and mine are the same. None of which makes any sense in the relative realm. But the spiritual domain doesn't have to conform to the separative, divisive explanations that we make do with here. I think this is important. I would just like to underline it because we've had, there is an evolution of psycho-spiritual thinking in the world today, and 120 years ago, whenever it was, William James produced, he was an American psychologist, spiritual psychologist, and he produced the religious experience of mankind. And this is a book, a reference book. This is a stepping stone. And in it, one of the things he said is, you and I are notes in the symphony, and we're essential notes. And what he was saying was pretty much what you just said about fractals. It is that everything is somehow a part of it, and we're a small piece, but we're an essential, unique small piece. And he underlined that truth. What he didn't say, and it's taken the Advaita Vedantists to show us this eloquently, is yes, and at the same time you are all. Brahman is Atman. You see, God is in the single separate expression, totally, not just partially. And that makes the mandate even more important, doesn't it? It means that if you have a spiritual destiny and you are shuffling your feet, treading water, a lot of people today that I see have a spiritual destiny, and they're reluctant in some way to follow it. And for every person who will realize it, then it's realized for all. That is the whole symphony. That's the whole symphony.
I might suggest that many people are, instead of not only not following the destiny, but not allowing it to unfold. They're for whatever reason, not welcoming it.
They're afraid to be swept along in the tsunami of the divine.
The unknown.
The unknown. Yeah.
I want to pick up on this very interesting sharing almost from the beginning about how other faith and spiritual traditions share this concept, if I can use that word, of separateness. Because you, near the very beginning of this lecture, part 2, you bring in symbolism as shared in other faith traditions. Again, let me read the passage and then I'll come back to the question to explore with you. This starts off a section in the lecture called Rising into the Heart. And you share, for those of you who are new to this, and those of you who have been listening for a while, I would like to offer a summary of the 3 stages, referring to your 3 stages of awakening. I have developed a 3-stage model of human development, which is crucially relevant to the modern world because today collective humanity is experiencing a birth. It is the birth into the heart. This has been symbolized as the virgin birth in Christianity, the 4th chakra, the Anahatma Puri, or heart mind in Hinduism, a union of male and female, the focus of Gesher Yoga or Hasidic wisdom in Judaism, the relationship to the beloved in Islam, and reflected on in the Heart Sutra in Buddhism, or Mahayana Buddhism. And this is an interesting correlation you speak of between your three-stage model and its symbolism in other faith and spiritual traditions. And I wanted to ask you if you can speak more about your three-stage model and its symbolically representation in the other faith and spiritual traditions that you cite. So, the virgin birth in Christianity, the heart mind in Hinduism, the focus in Geshe Yoga or Hasidic wisdom in Judaism, and then finally the Heart Sutra and the Mahayana Buddhism. Let me speak more to the correlation and the symbolism.
There's a little story that I told, I think, in my book, The Flight of Consciousness. I don't know if you recall it. I think I've got the right place. I was performing a piece of psychotherapy body work in a workshop one day, and I don't know what was going on. I don't remember. It's not so very important. But in body work, one responds very sensitively to the energy, to the breath, to the posture, and all this kind of thing. And at that time, I worked with quite a lot of Alexander technique teachers. And one of them in there suddenly lit up, and she said, "You are doing pure Alexander," which I know a bit about, but I had never trained in Alexander work. And I looked round to her and I said something like, "Well, you know, the truth is the truth. It just is." And so I think I mention this story because we get rather involved in these factions, don't we, in these kinds of approaches, and where I'm coming from, and what religion I'm following, or what therapy I do, and all this kind of thing. If it's real, if the models and the methodologies and the philosophies of it and so forth have any authenticity at all, then clearly there's going to be a correlate. Clearly they're going to converge on certain essential fundamentals of human evolution. Clearly, otherwise they wouldn't be with credence. They wouldn't have the truth in them. There's many different ways, but essentially, of course, they're all going the same way, and the methods and the approaches are not there to deviate from the natural unfolding of the human life, but rather to offer us different avenues and streets and fields to wander in to get there at some point or other. So my own experience of this, and I mentioned it to underline the crucialness of this rising into the heart at this present time, is that it is reflected in all valid spiritual paths. And so I wanted to really underline that by giving a paragraph of traditions and references. But what it says to us, because another danger, just incidentally, is because I've done it, and there's no point in trying to advise anybody of anything really, but I would just warn everybody off it a little bit. You can go as far as you like sideways on this, and when you've finished with Middle Eastern and Far Eastern and all the rest of it, religions, Western religions and whatever, you can go north and you can go south and you can go northeast and you can never stop. I mean, it's wonderful to read Joseph Campbell, and it's wonderful to read Professor Ninian Smart and all the people who've correlated all of these religious approaches. But it's forever, really. At some point you have to say, how many times do I have to hear the same thing? The same thing here is that the heart is the center. The heart is the very center. Now, I've not added perhaps, but I've made this point. The heart, firstly, not the anatomical heart, let's get that one out of the way, but the heart as in the center of compassion, or where I feel my merging in nature with all beings,
Mm.
if I'm centered there, is an extraordinary act. It's an extraordinary centering. And if you think about it from the point of view of an ordinary everyday life, I'd say what happens when you talk to people, any old people involved in psychospirituality, or lay people who don't give a damn, all people. Well, we're talking about cars, we're talking about jobs, we're talking about family, we're talking about money, we're talking about the state of the world, or politics, or war, or something. All of these things are lower chakra concerns. This is the material world, the relational, societal, cultural, global world. It's this place here where we are. And these are our major concerns. And of course, they're endless. However deeply we get into politics, state of the world, families, terrible things that are happening, our finances, our career, these things are absorbing endlessly.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't it the challenge of the rising into the heart, then, that we allow ourselves to transcend this? We never want to talk about any of that again, anywhere else, but from the heart center.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're in the animalistic concerns, the lower chakras of belonging, of tribal identity, of relationship and family and sexuality and blah, 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 food and shelter and blah, 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 all these things, that you're inclined to be in the realms of fear and desire, of course, and ego processes. Fear and desire is the fuel behind ego processes anyway, and of course you're totally enveloped in separateness, and therefore division,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore delusion,
Mm-hmm.
because you're not separate and you're not divided. But now you're fighting against everything to live, and then everything that's yours comes in on top of that, and then your opinions and all the rest of it. But when you rise into the heart, there's no other place to look at this from, and neither is there any place to be clear about it from other than the heart, and therefore effective. Therefore effective. And it's my contention, and I don't think it's a great revelation, we must all surely intuit it, that we desperately need a world of human beings who are centered in their authentic, compassionate hearts to deal with such a lot of incredibly complex, sophisticated problems as we have in the modern world. No one would want to take this on all by themselves. It's going to take immense wisdom. You might say it always would have done, but today it's somewhat more complex, because psychologically we've become so tremendously sophisticated and self-conscious. So my model of three-stage awakening is that in the first stage we work with the residue from our childhoods, our early conditioning, and the issues around survival, striving for identity, fear, desire and dependency, these obvious themes. And when you look at those obvious themes, they tend to dominate people's lives all the way. They dominate the collective, in fact. So old people are just as hung up on those primary, early, seminal conditions as is the 8-year-old, the 8-year-old, the 80-year-old, It's comme ci, comme ça. So let's find a way to introduce intelligent means to transcend what is obviously the challenges of childhood and adolescence, for a start, so that we don't bring them into the 20s, which are an extraordinary period of time, an extraordinary period which is lost to many people as a sort of grown-up childhood, really. And that's a tremendous waste. It's a tragic loss. Then for us to understand the 30s and the 40s, and my contention is that having followed intelligent and skillful means, to let go of projections and transference and all the rest of it, our reliance on the early conditioning, we evolve into a state of adulthood, or self-referring mature nature. And then we are urged just quite naturally to fulfill ourselves in the heart. And that's the second stage awakening, is to learn to live without this sense of separation, excuse me, between you and I, between me and any of it, and to open up into the flowering of the human life. The second stage awakening, therefore, is not a spiritual stage per se. It's not centrally spiritual. It is soulful, though. It's very much about the awakening of the soul and the setting of your feet on the ground here and feeling the world in it with awareness. And latterly, through that stage, preparing, if it's your propensity and if you have the capacity and the potential and the destiny, and not everyone does, and I may as well upset people now by saying spirituality is not egalitarianism. We accept people as they are. Let's not try and inculcate or drum people into the spiritual realms when they have no interest or no will, or they're too scared, or who knows why. But it just is as it is, and you accept them and you love them and you feel compassion towards them accordingly. But you begin to notice that some people have a powerful capacity and potential and then subsequent destiny for spirituality, whereas others have it for something else. And that's fine. So if through the second stage, which is the second stage of awakening, but the latter part, which I would describe as preparation for the spiritual life, we then enter into third stage awakening. Third stage awakening is the period of sadhana, or spiritual discipline, living your life as a sacred, spiritual, creative act.
The So that aspect that you just shared, or recently shared, about the lower chakra systems and the reality of the lower chakra system, we're going to pick up later in the lecture, and perhaps not discuss it today, but in another interview. But I want to come back to this theme you brought up in responding to the question, and the theme being the early childhood. And this is a fundamental tenet in the sacred attention therapy, because as you talked about in stage one, really it's about transcending all of those egoic processes, all of that childhood conditioning. And my understanding is that you're a learned parent. You're a learned parent, given your life experiences to this point. And I want to share just a couple of passages leading in to, I think, a really important question. And a couple of paragraphs are related to childhood. Childhood should be a time for establishing our foundations, our reference points to life, to learn to live with others, to feel with others, to learn about ourselves and our deeper emotional, creative, and passionate lives. More than anything, it should be about learning to live in the mystery of existence, spiritually, in trust and insight, peace, tolerance, and understanding. But in our culture, children growing up have an enormously difficult time. You almost certainly did. I know I did. No one of any wisdom was there to offer anything intelligent, wise, insightful, or to even give guidance or mentoring in what I should be seeking, where I was going, or what I was doing. Childhood, therefore, for the vast majority, if not all, is about survival, endurance, uncertainty, insecurity, disappointment, commitment, subservience, searching for sensitivity, trying to belong, struggling to get needs met, to understand power structures and relationships, to create a sense of self, a vehicle that will see you through life and to connect your doing to your being in an authentic relationship. Not only are these matters never resolved, but they live on in the presenting issues I listed for you in the last discourse, which included guilt, betrayal, punishment, jealousy, neediness, and distrust. And I wanted to ask, highlighting this comment that childhood, therefore, for the vast majority, if not at all, is about survival, endurance, uncertainty, and on. Can parents avoid having their children go up in a milieu of survival? And if so, how?
Well, I think that it's not just a personal matter. I think it's a collective matter of where we are in our humanity's evolution at this time. And right now, no. Whether in the future, which I think I can envision a way in the future, but we're not there yet, and it's not going to happen in the next several generations of life. Like a lifetime, it's gonna take a while for any of that to change. But even if it wants to change, in a sense, because you see, it's a subjective experience. This whole business of you can't wipe this away, the things that I've said there, which perhaps sound quite extreme, by saying, well, my kid's really happy and they're doing fine and they're very good at school and all of this, because it's so hard to begin to even know yourself, let alone to know anybody else. And as far as knowing your children go, that's very difficult because of your personal investment in it. The experiences in the birth canal, for example, I mean, the hero's journey from the cervix to the vulva, I mean, that is so extraordinary. No one is going to remember it. What does that tell us? You can remember it. And I and many people I know have remembered it by stimulating the body memory and doing certain skillful practices that bring that about with skillful help, of course. And then you can remember it in great detail. But isn't it curious that we've all had that experience, that heroic journey, and no one remembers it? In fact, many people don't remember the first several years of their life. What does that tell us about? We know why you suffer memory loss about things. We know something about repression and not remembering things. And since this is endemic, it points us towards the intensity, the suffering, the pain, the tremendous endurance, and all the fill in the gaps, the other details of each of our individual struggles for survival. And I think this is how it is at the moment. What we can do is we can do something about birth processes. Birth processes are state of the art. They weren't, by the way, in the 70s and the 80s, just about, but many things happened in the 70s, 80s that sort of flared up, were a tremendous blaze, and then just went phut. And if people had listened to Le Boyer and Michel Odent, maybe we'd have some intelligent birthing going on. But what happened, as usual, to so many things from that time, which include therapy, which include feminism, which include the male movement, the men's movement, and many other things, was they all got subsumed by the establishment. And now, at least in Europe, they would make you think that a water birth was coming to hospital in this funny little white room surrounded by appliances and people like this, and having a natural water birth. I mean, it's complete nonsense. It's just been taken in. It starts at birth, of course. And two things we really need to radically change is education and how we bring people into the world. Bring people into the world in a sacred, aware, intensely spiritual, soulful, respectful, reverential way. What do we expect is going to happen if you bring people out in a state of fear, with everybody scared for their lives, in an irreverential environment, and then you assault them physically to make sure they're breathing, and then you wonder why the world's full of violence? So it starts there. And then in education, if we don't understand the evolving inner world of the child, and we try and do things which are also an assault, like try and reduce their focus to the written word and sit them in seats when the physical body's not ready for that sort of limitation, that sort of restriction. This is violence on violence. So there's a lot we can do there to change it. It won't necessarily change survival and the need for identity, because of the state of the collective, the evolution of humanity itself. But if we can introduce just one thing, and all those other things would be helpful along the way, to say the least. But if as parents you can practice with your child being in the mystery, introducing them to God, not as a dogma, of course, not through some religious morality or what I should or shouldn't do, all this kind of thing, but by introducing them to the deity through a direct experience, a direct physical, emotional, energetic experience of how that is and how that feels and how the world is. You've got it all on your side, really, as a parent. You don't have to be a spiritual teacher or a guide or this, that, and the other in any formal sense. You are, of course, all those things as a parent anyhow. But if you can sit quietly with your child by a tree, look at the sky, in your own example, in your model of the way of living, show that you're not ever assuming the next moment or expecting anything, and help the child to feel comfortable with not knowing and living in the mystery of the divine, that would be a revolution in itself, wouldn't it?
There is another lecture, and I can't remember which one it is, Richard, but you speak of the contrast between what I'm going to call traditional societal childbirth, which typically takes place in an institutional setting, and what you refer to often as natural childbirth. And you ask, when I read the question, it was one of those things that, it made me sit up straight, and a very interesting question you asked, and I remember it was, why has childbirth become a medical intervention? The act of, taking the child in utero out of their home, the family environment, into a sterile environment that is anything but natural. And it was a very interesting question to ponder. I mean, not being a parent myself, it wasn't anything that, there was really reason for me to ponder. But reading the question did make me sit back and say, that is interesting. Why have we as a culture, at least in the West, treated it as such, as a medical intervention? And certainly it's something that's cause for discussion in many milieux, especially of late. I want to leave today's interview there, and I want to pick up when we come together again to talk about the implications of this biophysical development of an adult in the context of what I think you referred to as a stunted childhood development based on these early childhood experiences. It's a very interesting and I think important aspect to explore in the context not only of your total work in the 3 stages of awakening, but this particular Awakening to Heart Nature lecture. So I'll look forward to picking up there the next time we come together.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Till next time.
Till next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.